Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping hailed deepening ties between Russia and China in talks Friday, despite signs that Beijing is impatient with the wider political and economic impact of Russia's struggling invasion of Ukraine. Russia would seek to strengthen military cooperation with China, with relations between the two countries at their best in history, Putin said in the video call, the first since the leaders met in person in September. China stands ready to expand their strategic partnership, she said. U.S. President Joe Biden signed a $1.7 trillion government funding bill that includes $47 billion in additional aid for Ukraine. The U.S. is considering sending Bradley fighting vehicles to Ukraine as part of a further package of military support, according to people familiar with the matter. Beijing has refused to publicly condemn the invasion or even to call it a war, instead accusing the U.S. of provoking Russia by pushing to expand the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Ukraine is fixing the relatively minor damage to its energy system caused by Russia's missile and drone attacks over the past day, Ukrainian energy operator Ukrenergo. Belarus is looking into whether a Ukrainian missile entered its airspace Thursday by mistake or as an intentional provocation from Kyiv's troops, Air Force Commander Kirill Kazantsev said in a video statement on the Defense Ministry Telegram channel. Alyona Verbitska, an advisor to Ukraine's president, said Russia had confirmed that it was holding more than 3,000 prisoners of war. She said 15,000 people were missing, many of them civilians. The defense forces of Ukraine killed over 50 occupiers near the occupied city of Berdyansk, Zaporizhia Oblast, on December 28. During the day, Ukraine's Air Force conducted 12 strikes on the clusters of personnel, weapons, and military equipment and a strike on the position of Russian anti-aircraft missile systems. In addition, Ukraine's rocket forces and artillery hit 4 command posts and 3 clusters of Russian military personnel. The Investigative Committee of Russia, SKR, has stated that after Mariupol was taken under the control of the Russian Federation, over 3,000 bodies of dead civilians had been found in the city. The Russians accuse representatives of the Ukrainian military command of these atrocities. The bodies of 51 civilians were found in the positions left by Ukrainian troops in April 2022 alone, and after the complete liberation and inspection of the city, their number was over 3,000. The damage caused by their illegal actions, which were expressed in the deliberate use of the city and its civilian infrastructure for military purposes, amounted to over 176 billion rubles, roughly $1,294,117,000 US. Edition. Allegedly, there were British citizens who trained Ukrainians for urban warfare in the 36th Separate Marine Brigade, while instructors from Germany taught storming buildings and firing from foreign-made weapons. According to the investigative committee, experts inspected over 68,000 residential premises and infrastructure in the occupied territories of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts and estimated the damage to be at least 228 billion and 234 million rubles, respectively. Roughly $1,678,191,176 US. Edition. Mariupol defenders came to the Russian-controlled territory on 16 to 20 May and were captured. According to the Russian side, 2,439 fighters came out of the Azovstal bunkers, while the Ukrainian side reported that 2,449 people did. Some of them were later exchanged as prisoners of war. It is unknown how many people died in Mariupol. Legitimate authorities estimated the loss of at least 10,000 or 20,000 residents. Almost all houses in the city were either damaged or destroyed. Residents of the Ukrainian capital Kyiv have been urged to head to air raid shelters as sirens wailed across the city, a day after Russia carried out the biggest aerial assault since it started the war in February. Shortly after 2 a.m. on Friday, Kyiv's city government issued an alert on its Telegram messaging app channel about the air raid sirens and called on residents to proceed to shelters. Kyiv says Iran is supplying Moscow with drones for its air attacks, but Tehran says it last sent drones to Russia before the war started. The General Staff of Ukraine's Armed Forces Friday morning report said Russia had launched 85 missile strikes, 35 airstrikes, and 63 strikes from multiple rocket launch systems in the past 24 hours. It said Moscow's forces also shelled 20 settlements around the bombed-out town of Bakhmut in eastern Ukraine, where some of the fiercest fighting is being waged, and more than 25 settlements in the Kherson and Zaporizhia regions. Reuters footage on Thursday showed emergency workers searching through the smoldering wreckage of homes in Kyiv destroyed by a blast and smoke trails of missiles in the sky. Officials had earlier said more than 120 missiles were fired during Thursday's assault. More than 18 residential buildings and 10 critical infrastructure installations were destroyed in the latest attacks, the Defense Ministry said in a statement. The United States last week announced nearly $2 billion $3 billion Australian dollars in additional military aid, including the Patriot air defense system, which offers protection against aircraft, cruise, and ballistic missiles. Britain on Friday said it has given Ukraine more than 1,000 metal detectors and 100 kits to deactivate bombs and to help clear minefields. Moscow has repeatedly denied targeting civilians, but Ukraine says its daily bombardment is destroying cities, towns, and the country's power, medical and other infrastructure. Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24 in what President Vladimir Putin calls a special military operation against what it perceives as threats to its security. Ukraine and its Western allies have denounced Russia's actions as an imperialist-style land grab and imposed sanctions to try to disrupt the campaign. The 11-month war has killed tens of thousands of people, driven millions from their homes, left cities in ruins and shaken the global economy, driving up energy and food prices. The heaviest fighting is in the eastern Donetsk and Luhansk provinces that together make up the industrial Donbas region. Russia claimed in September to have annexed them, along with the southern provinces of Kherson and Zaporizhia, but does not fully control any of them. Belarus has protested to Ukraine's ambassador after saying it had shot down a Ukrainian S-300 air defense missile in a field, during one of Russia's heaviest aerial onslaughts against Kyiv and other cities since the start of the war. State news agency Belta first reported that a S-300 missile, used by both Ukraine and Russia, had landed inside Belarus on Thursday morning, with a statement from Belarus's defense ministry confirming that the missile had been brought down by its air defense units between 10 a.m. and 11 a.m. local time. Pieces of the missile were found in a crop field in the vicinity of the village of Gorbaka, Ivanova district. Fragments were found in an agricultural field. The wreckage belongs to an S-300 anti-aircraft guided missile fired from the territory of Ukraine, the defense ministry said. Thursday's incident comes 10 days after Vladimir Putin, Russia's president, visited Belarus, a close ally of the Kremlin, for talks with its president, Alexander Lukashenko. Ukraine's military said it had shot down 54 missiles out of 69 launched by Russia. Air raid sirens rang out across Ukraine and in Kyiv sounded for 5 hours. Officials had earlier said more than 120 missiles were fired into Ukraine during the attack. Belarus has summoned the Ukrainian ambassador after a missile landed in the country. The ambassador was summoned after Belarus claimed its defense systems had shot down an Ukrainian missile on Thursday. After Russian missiles rained down on Ukraine on Thursday, Belarus Defense Ministry said its defenses shot down a S-300 missile near the village of Harbacha in the Brest region, some 15 kilometers, 9 miles from the border. Later, in a video message shared on social media by the state-run Belta news agency, the military commissar of Belarus Brest region said, "Locals have absolutely nothing to worry about. Unfortunately, these things happen." Despite claiming that it is not involved in the war, Belarus has allowed parts of its territory to be used as a launchpad for Russian attacks into Ukraine. In Ukraine, Mikhailo Podolyak, an advisor to President Volodymyr Zelensky, said over 120 missiles had been launched by Russia. Ukraine is investigating more than 58,000 potential Russian war crimes, killings, kidnappings, indiscriminate bombings, and sexual assaults. Reporting by the Associated Press and Frontline, recorded in a public database, has independently verified more than 600 incidents that appear to violate the laws of war. Some of those attacks were massacres that killed dozens or hundreds of civilians, and as a totality it could account for thousands of individual war crimes. Even in successful prosecutions, the limits of justice so far are glaring. Take the case of Vadim Shishimarin, a baby-faced 21-year-old tank commander who was the first Russian tried on war crimes charges. He surrendered in March and pleaded guilty in a Kyiv courtroom in May to shooting a 62-year-old Ukrainian civilian in the head. Moscow's UN ambassador, Vasily Nebenzia, said no civilians were tortured and killed in the Kyiv suburb of Bucha despite the meticulous documentation of the atrocities by AP, other journalists, and war crimes investigators there. Still, the resulting database details 10 months of attacks that appear to violate the laws of war, including 93 attacks on schools, 36 where children were killed, and more than 200 direct attacks on civilians, including torture, the kidnapping and killing of civilians, and the desecration of dead bodies. Among Russia's targets, churches, cultural centers, hospitals, food facilities, and electrical infrastructure. The database catalogs how Russia utilized cluster bombs and other indiscriminate weapons in residential neighborhoods and to attack buildings housing civilians. Russian forces carried out 51 strikes on border Hromadas in Sumy Oblast on December 29. Russians fired mortars on Bilopilia Hromada, with 34 strikes. A private house was damaged as a result of the attacks. Windows were broken and a fence destroyed. The Russians dropped 4 explosives from a drone on the Krasnopilia Hromada along the border. They also fired mortars twice. In total, there were 9 strikes. The Russian army fired from a helicopter on the border areas of Velika Pisarivka Hromada. They launched 4 unguided aircraft missiles. ZHYVYTSKYY noted that there were no casualties in any of the Hromadas. Also on Thursday, December 29, air defense units shot down 2 Russian missiles over Sumy Oblast. Ukrainian air defense systems shot down 5 Russian Shahid drones in 3 districts of Dnipropetrovsk Oblast on the night of 29 to 30 December. For the second night in a row, our defenders of the sky destroyed all 5 Russian Shahid drones that were over the oblast. They shot down kamikaze drones in 3 districts. Reznichenko also reported that Nikopol had once again suffered from heavy artillery fire by the Russians overnight. Marinets Hromada, an administrative unit designating a town, village or several villages and their adjacent territories, was attacked. Almost 30 Russian projectiles landed there. It was reported earlier that the defense forces of Ukraine had shot down 10 Russian attack drones in Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhia oblasts on the night of 29 to 30 December. Russia attacked Ukraine with 16 Iranian-made Shahid drones overnight on December 30, Ukraine's Air Force reported. Ukraine's air defense downed all of the drones, which were launched at Ukraine from the north and southeast of the country. Earlier on December 30, the Kyiv City Military Administration reported that one of the drone's loitering munition packages hit and damaged an administrative building in Kyiv's Holosivsky district and shattered some of the windows of an adjacent building. NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg called on NATO member states to supply more weapons to Ukraine, according to an interview published on Friday. He said it was perhaps even more important that Ukraine receive enough ammunition for the systems already in place, adding that the need for ammunition and spare parts was enormous. Last week, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, in an address to a group of Western leaders, asked for a wide range of weapons and air defense systems to help efforts to counter the Russian invasion. Also, the United States last week announced nearly $2 billion in additional military aid, including the Patriot air defense system, which offers protection against aircraft, cruise and ballistic missiles. NATO's Stoltenberg told DPA that military support for Ukraine was the fastest way to peace. Ukraine and its Western allies have denounced Russia's actions as an imperialist-style land grab and imposed sanctions to try to disrupt the campaign. The 11-month war has killed tens of thousands of people, driven millions from their homes, left cities in ruins and shaken the global economy, driving up energy and food prices. The UK has supplied Ukraine with over 1,000 Valin metal detectors and 100 bomb de-arming kits to help clear the country's minefields and make safe reclaimed territory, civilian homes, and infrastructure, the UK government said in a statement on December 30. Russia's use of landmines and targeting of civilian infrastructure underline the shocking cruelty of Putin's invasion, UK Defence Secretary Ben Wallace said. This latest package of UK support will help Ukraine safely clear land and buildings as it reclaims its rightful territory. In mid-November, Ukraine's State Emergency Service reported that nearly 30% of Ukrainian territory was mined. That equals about 2 areas of Austria, Serhiy Kruk, who heads Ukraine's State Emergency Service, then said. On December 29, Wallace announced that the UK will commit $2.77 billion in aid to Ukraine in 2023. Since the very beginning of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, some of the Kremlin's fiercest battles have been fought by a lawless private army, its ranks swelled by convicted felons. At its head is Yevgeny Prigozhin, a Russian oligarch and mercenary leader who this year has become perhaps the most conspicuous avatar of everything that is darkest about his motherland. In his fusion of crooked money and brutal violence, his sneering cynicism, and his impunity in the face of even Russian law, he embodies the malevolence of state-sponsored corruption in a way few can match. That's why, as his hired guns rain death on yet another Ukrainian city, a panel of judges convened by OCCRP has chosen Prigozhin as 2022's Person of the Year in Organized Crime and Corruption. Russian President Vladimir Putin said on Friday he was expecting Chinese President Xi Jinping to make a state visit early next year in what would be a public show of solidarity from Beijing as Russia's invasion of Ukraine falters. But an official Chinese readout of a video summit between the two leaders highlighted differences in approach to their developing alliance, making no mention of a visit and stressing that Beijing, which has declined to back or condemn the invasion, would maintain its objective and fair stance on the issue. Since sending its troops into Ukraine in February, Russia has turned its back on the Western powers that have ostracized it economically and politically and armed Ukraine, courting the rising global power of longtime rival China instead. He also said he aimed to boost military cooperation with China, although there was no mention of this in the Chinese state broadcaster CCTV's report of the call. Although she called Putin his dear friend, his introductory statement, at around a quarter the length of Putin's, was far more pragmatic in tone. The two men had signed a no-limits strategic partnership in February, informed by shared distrust of the West, a few days before Russia sent its armed forces into Ukraine in what it terms a special military operation. Trade soars. On Friday, Russia's finance ministry doubled the maximum possible share of Chinese yuan in its National Wealth Fund, NWF, to 60% as Moscow tries to de-dollarize its economy and end dependency on unfriendly nations including the United States, European Union members, Britain and Japan. Moscow has also publicly backed Xi's position on Taiwan and accused the West of trying to provoke a conflict over the status of the self-governing island, which China claims as its own. Putin told Xi, "You and I share the same views on the causes, course and logic of the ongoing transformation of the global geopolitical landscape, in the face of unprecedented pressure and provocations from the West." However, the Chinese leader has been less vocal in his criticism of Western countries that are China's key export market, and has appeared cool on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. China has refrained from condemnation, instead stressing the need for peace, but Putin in September publicly acknowledged that his Chinese counterpart had concerns about Russia's actions. Russian President Vladimir Putin said on Friday that Russia had become one of China's leading suppliers of oil and gas, with 13.8 billion cubic meters of gas shipped to China via the Power of Siberia pipeline in the first 11 months of 2022. In remarks at the start of a video conference with Chinese President Xi Jinping, Putin said, "According to the results of this year, Russia has become one of the leaders in oil exports to China." Russia overtook Saudi Arabia as China's top crude supplier last month. Putin added that Russia was China's second largest supplier of pipeline gas and fourth largest of liquefied natural gas, LNG. He said that in December, shipments had been 18% above daily contractual obligations. Russian energy exports to China have risen markedly since Moscow sent its armed forces into Ukraine on February 24, after which Western countries imposed unprecedented sanctions on Russia. Deputy Prime Minister Alexander Novak said on November 29 that Russia's energy exports to China had increased in value by 64% this year, and by 10% in volume. Russian soldiers fighting in Ukraine will have access to free sperm freezing, reports the Russian state news agency TASS. According to Igor Trunov, president of the Russian Union of Lawyers, the government has approved the funding of sperm freezing, to be stored in cryobanks, for mobilized soldiers fighting in the invasion of Ukraine. The families of those called up for military service as part of the partial mobilization will receive free access to fertility treatment and the storage of biomaterial in a cryobank. One medical center had reported a 30-fold increase in applications regarding storing, per the Times. Putin launched his partial military mobilization of Russian military reservists in September, hoping to deploy 300,000 more soldiers to fight in his invasion of Ukraine, with the exact number of mobilized men still classified. Indeed, reservists mobilized by the Russian military are being sent to fight in Ukraine despite having serious, chronic health conditions, the UK's Ministry of Defence, MOD, said in November. Other reports said that some mobilized soldiers were not even old enough to fight. A BBC Russia report from earlier this week said it had confirmed the death of 10,500 Russian soldiers, with 492 of these men thought to be mobilized soldiers, but it admitted that our list may contain at least 40 to 60% fewer names of the dead than actually buried in Russia. In November, a U.S. military chief put the number of Russian soldiers killed or wounded at up to 100,000, according to CNN.